The document still has the coffee stain on page 3. Right there, bleeding into the paragraph that lists my name, Aisha Malik, Deputy Diplomatic Attaché, Earth Sovereign Mission, as one of the parties legally required to acknowledge receipt. I acknowledged it. I signed it. And then I said something to Ambassador Vethsar that I will not repeat here, except to note that it rhymed, and that the Council's court translator requested a 5-minute recess immediately afterward. That was the day Earth got evicted from the Galactic Council of Sovereign Worlds. The document is laminated now. It sits on the corner of my desk in Islamabad, next to a dead succulent that somehow refuses to actually die, and a photograph of the unaligned corridor's first routing map drawn on the back of a takeaway menu from a Mund Station noodle stall. 11 years of my life, documented in bad handwriting and a coffee stain. But I am getting ahead of myself. The charges were 17 pages long. I read them on a shuttle back to the Earth mission quarters, standing in the aisle because every seat was taken by junior staff who looked like they had been told the planet was being auctioned off. The charges were, in the Council's formal language, as follows: unilateral economic destabilization of protected trade zones, repeated violation of the Equilibrium Accords, and cultural contamination of 3 civilizations under Council developmental stewardship. What that meant, in the language that people actually speak, was this. There was a species called the Doveri. Small people, barely a meter tall, copper-colored skin that reflected light in a way that made them look like they were always standing in late afternoon sun. They lived on a cluster of moons in a system the Council had classified as a Tier 4 protected zone, which meant the Council had decided the Doveri were not advanced enough to participate in galactic society yet, and therefore needed to be left alone to develop naturally, which in practice meant left alone to die of a respiratory infection that had been burning through their population for 6 years. The Council had a word for this. They called it developmental integrity. I had a different word for it. I had several, in fact, but the one I used in official correspondence was unconscionable. Our medical team, 3 doctors and a supply coordinator named Patrick, who had once managed aid distribution in 3 conflict zones simultaneously and had the gray hair to prove it, had been operating a quiet assistance program for 14 months. Antibiotics, respiratory filters, basic equipment that cost the Earth mission the equivalent of a mid-tier conference budget. The Doveri population stabilized. Then it grew. The Council found out in month 15. Vethsar himself delivered the preliminary notice. He was a tall species, the Veth, elongated limbs, faces that looked like someone had pressed a human face gently from behind and hadn't quite stopped in time. He set the document on the table between us with the careful precision of a man placing a weapon. "This is a serious matter," he said. "People are alive," I said. "I find that less serious." He looked at me for a very long time. The Veth have this quality stillness that isn't calm, exactly, more like the surface of water above something moving underneath. The Accords exist to protect species from interference that disrupts organic development. The Doveri were dying. They were developing. I put my coffee down. I looked at him. I thought about the respiratory ward footage Patrick had sent me in month 2 before I approved the program. I thought about a particular frame, a Doveri child, no more than 4 years old by their developmental scale, sitting in a doorway in the kind of stillness that children only have when they are very sick or very afraid. "Vethsar," I said, "with the greatest respect for the centuries of work this Council has done, no. We are not having this conversation the way you want to have it." That was the polite version of what happened. The impolite version is what ended up, summarized, on page 12 of the charge sheet. The formal expulsion hearing lasted 2 days. Earth's senior mission staff sat on one side of a curved table that seemed specifically designed to make you feel like you were being looked down at from every angle. 41 Council member delegations were present. 38 voted in favor of expulsion. 2 abstained. One voted against. The one that voted against was the Veth. I did not understand that at the time. I thought it was procedural. I found out later, years later, that it was Veth Sar himself who had submitted the dissenting vote quietly without announcing it, and then said nothing about it to anyone. Not then. Earth was given 90 galactic days to vacate all Council-adjacent space lanes, dissolve our mission offices, and recall personnel from 3 joint research stations. Our trade licenses in Council-registered systems were suspended. Our communication relays in the protected corridors were to be decommissioned. On the shuttle back, a different shuttle this time, a bigger one, carrying most of the mission staff, nobody spoke for the first 40 minutes. Patrick sat across from me with a cup of something he wasn't drinking and stared at the floor. "We could appeal," said one of the junior diplomats. A young woman named Claire, 26 years old, top of her cohort, who had wanted to work in galactic diplomacy since she was 12. "We could," I said. "But you don't think we should?" I looked at the window. Space outside was the specific dark that doesn't have a name in any human language because we only started spending real time in it recently. Not black, not navy, not the dark of a room with the lights off. Something older than color. "No," I said, "I don't." She waited. Everyone on that shuttle was waiting, I think, without knowing they were doing it. An appeal means we spend the next 3 years asking their permission to exist in their system, on their terms, inside their definition of what we should be. And maybe we win. And then we spend the next decade walking on eggshells inside a structure that was built to keep us exactly as small as it needs us to be. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. "No." "So what do we do?" Claire asked. I had a folder open on my tablet. I had been building it for 4 years. I had started building it the first time I sat in a council chamber and watched a non-member species get denied basic trade access because their application didn't comply with a formatting standard that had last been updated in what was, for them, the equivalent of the Bronze Age. The folder had 14 points. "We do something else," I said. Patrick finally drank his coffee. He made a face. He looked up at me. "You already know what," he said. It was not a question. "I've had some time to think." He nodded slowly. He looked back at the floor. Then he said very quietly so only I could hear it, "The Doveri are still alive." Yes. They were. And somewhere in that fact was the whole argument, every page of it, every implication, every door it opened, and every comfortable assumption it burned down. The council had a system. The system had rules. The rules had, for a very long time, been the only option available. We had 90 galactic days to leave. I spent the first 3 of them reading the folder. Then I spent the next 4 drafting 6 letters, to 6 specific parties, in 6 different communication formats. Because 2 of them didn't use standard galactic script, one of them communicated primarily through structured data packets, and one of them, the Veth, I wrote to by hand. In the formal long script their diplomatic tradition considered the only appropriate medium for serious correspondence. Veth Sar did not reply. His deputy did, 9 days later. The reply was 3 lines. It said, "The enclosed routing information is provided for informational purposes only and does not constitute official engagement." The enclosed routing information was a map, a detailed one, of every gap in the Council's protected lane network, every stretch of unregistered space between their official corridors. I looked at that map for a long time. Then I added it to the folder. The Council thought they were ending something. They were precise about it, very thorough, very correct in their procedures. They filed every form. They observed every protocol. They gave us our 90 days and they watched us pack up and leave, and I imagine some of them felt that it was, on balance, a clean resolution to an untidy situation. What they did not know, what I had spent 4 years quietly making sure they would not know until it was too late to matter, was that being removed from their table was not the same as being removed from the conversation. I had read their map. I had read it very carefully, and what their map showed, if you looked at it the right way, was not a cage. It was a blueprint. The shuttle docked at the transit hub above Earth 7 hours later. I walked out into the arrivals corridor carrying the laminated copy of the expulsion notice. Someone had laminated it. I still don't know who. It was just handed to me at some point during the chaos of departure. And I found the Secretary General waiting with his hands folded and an expression that sat somewhere between grief and constipation. "Aisha," he said. "I need a conference room," I said. "And Patrick, and whoever in the trade division can read a routing map without asking me to explain what a routing map is." He blinked. "That's it." And coffee, real coffee. Whatever they were serving in the council building tasted like it had been filtered through procedural paperwork. He stared at me. He had known me for 11 years. He knew what the folder meant. He knew the look I had, not the look of a person who had lost something, but the look of a person who had been waiting for a specific door to open. "You were ready for this," he said. Listen," I said and picked up my bag. "I was ready for this 4 years ago. I just needed them to go first." The conference room was booked for 6 weeks. By week 2, it was 3 rooms. By week 6, we had outgrown the building. The folder had 14 points. The folder was just the beginning. 6 months after the expulsion notice, there was still a council observer post stationed at the edge of what had recently become, with very little fanfare, the first registered corridor of the Sovereign Trade Initiative. The post was a small automated relay, nothing dramatic, just a sensor array and a communication module that logged traffic and filed reports back to council monitoring. It had been there since week 3, parked at a careful distance, saying nothing. I sent it coffee. Not metaphorically. A physical package, drone-delivered, containing 3 vacuum-sealed bags of Ethiopian single origin and a short note that said, "There is more where this came from. The coffee, too." The relay could not drink coffee. That was not the point. The point was that I knew it was there, and now they knew that I knew, and the little performance of courtesy, casual, unbothered, almost cheerful, was its own kind of communication in a language diplomats understand much better than the formal kind. Patrick thought it was the funniest thing I had ever done. Claire, who had stayed on and was by now running point on our communications infrastructure, thought it was terrifying. She was right on both counts. The Sovereign Trade Initiative had not been announced. That was deliberate. Nothing about the early months was announced, because announcement invites response, and response, from the Council, from their allied trade bodies, from the 14 species whose economic models depended on Council lane access, would have arrived before we had anything solid enough to defend. So we built quietly. We filed incorporation documents under general commerce frameworks. We routed initial contacts through existing bilateral agreements that predated the Council structure. We were, on paper, simply a collection of independent parties exploring mutual trade facilitation. What we were actually doing was threading a needle through 40 light-years of unregistered space. The Veth were first. They did not announce it either. The Veth had a political tradition that treated public declaration as the last resort of people who had run out of better options. Their representative, not a senior diplomat, a mid-tier trade coordinator named Ossel, who had the specific quality of looking like he was always about to sneeze and never quite doing it, arrived at our temporary offices in Geneva with a data packet and a single sentence. "We are prepared to explore routing options in the unregistered corridor sections identified in previous correspondence." Previous correspondence. He meant the map his deputy had sent me, the map that had arrived 9 days after the expulsion vote, the map that Vethsar himself had quietly, without announcement, made sure reached me. I had been thinking about that vote for 6 months. We signed the first framework agreement with the Veth on a Tuesday. It was 11 pages long, intentionally simple, written in language that both sides' trade teams had reviewed for a combined total of about 90 hours. Ossel initialed every page with a small, neat mark that looked like a compressed wave. Afterward, we sat in the Geneva office, and he accepted a cup of coffee. The Veth had discovered coffee through our mission staff years earlier, and had developed what could only be described as a civilizational-level enthusiasm for it. And he looked out the window at the Alps and he said, "The Council will notice." "Yes," I said. "They will object." "Probably." He drank his coffee. He looked at the Alps some more. "Our agricultural output in the eastern settlement clusters has declined significantly due to lane access restrictions on fertilizer imports," he said, in exactly the same tone as everything else he had said, which was the tone of a man reading from a grocery list. "The restrictions were applied 18 months ago as a compliance measure." I waited. The compliance measure required us to reroute certain imports through a council-registered secondary hub, adding approximately 40% to our transit time and cost. "That sounds frustrating," I said. "It is," he said. He finished his coffee. "Unregistered corridors would not have this problem." "No," I said, "they wouldn't." The Corey Collective came 3 weeks later. The Corey were not small and they were not quiet. They arrived as a delegation of 7, which was 4 more than we had chairs for, and their lead negotiator, a woman named Vel, by the rough approximation of her name in standard script, opened the meeting by placing a list of 43 specific cargo types on the table and asking which of them we could handle in the first 6 months of operation. I looked at the list. I looked at Patrick, who had been coordinating our logistics framework and had the gray hair to prove it, and he looked at the list and then at me and made a very small gesture with his hand that meant, "We can do 31 of these without blinking. Let me check the other 12. "We can discuss all 43, I said. Vel looked at me for a moment. Her species had a secondary eyelid, translucent, moved horizontally, that closed briefly when they were processing something they hadn't expected. Hers closed once. "All 43, she said. "All 43. They signed the same week. Mund Station followed a month later. Mund was different from our other partners. Less a species and more a place. A massive transit hub in genuinely unclaimed space that had operated for 2 centuries as an independent waypoint serving whoever showed up with good cargo and reliable credits. It had no government in the traditional sense, only an administrative body called the Station Authority, run by a rotating council of 7 operators who made decisions by a process that combined formal voting with what appeared to be aggressive strategic eating around a shared table. The chair of the Station Authority was a man named Owen, a human, actually, one of about 3,000 humans who had ended up at Mund Station over the preceding 50 years through various routes, most of them involving either serious ambition or serious trouble or both. He had a face like someone had assembled it from spare parts during a rush and hadn't been unhappy with the result. And he spoke in the specific clipped cadence of someone who had learned to communicate across 12 language groups and had decided efficiency was more important than charm. "You want us as a hub anchor," he said in the 3rd minute of our first meeting. "Central waypoint for your corridor network. We provide the physical infrastructure, the repair facilities, the bonded cargo storage. You provide the traffic." "And the security framework," I said. He looked at me. "Security. The corridor will need a charter, common rules of transit, dispute resolution, basic protection protocols for member cargo. You're building a legal system. I'm building the minimum necessary for people to trust the route enough to use it." He was quiet for a moment. He had a coffee on his desk. The humans at Mund Station had apparently been largely responsible for introducing coffee to about 8 species in the surrounding region, which I chose to take as a good sign, and he turned it in his hands without drinking it. "The council won't like this," he said. "No," I said. They'll apply pressure on anyone who signs. They will try. He nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. He looked at the routing map I had laid on his desk. The same map, refined now through 6 months of survey work and the Veth's detailed gap analysis. And he put his finger on the point where Mund Station sat, exactly where 3 potential corridors intersected, right in the middle of the most efficient route through unregistered space between the outer systems and the Council's eastern boundary. "We've been independent for 200 years, he said. "The Council has never loved us." "I know. They've tried to reclassify our status 3 times, tried to make us apply for registration as a commercial entity under their framework. Would have meant submitting to their inspection regime, their fee structure, their routing priority system." He paused. "We said no, 3 times. I know that too. So you know we're not afraid of them." "I was counting on it," I said. He put down the coffee. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been playing a particular game for a long time and has just recognized someone who plays the same game. 50-year anchor agreement, he said. "We retain full administrative independence. Your charter applies to traffic, not to station operations." "Agreed. We want a seat on whatever governing body you build. There will be a council, lowercase. Every anchor partner gets a seat." He looked at me a moment longer. "Then, you're going to make the GCSW very unhappy." "That," I said, "is an interesting way to describe my professional goals." Owen signed that afternoon. By the end of the first year, we had 11 partners. By the end of the second, we had 23. Each new partner brought their own particular combination of resources, grievances, cargo types, and institutional memory of exactly how the Council's system had failed them. The Dovery sent a trade observer, a single representative, young, formally dressed, who sat in every meeting and took detailed notes and said almost nothing until the 3rd month, when she quietly asked if the Compact's charter could include a provision for humanitarian cargo priority in emergency situations. I had already drafted it. I showed her the clause. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said in her careful standard script, "Our people had a fever." "I know," I said. "You got in trouble for it." "It turned out fine." She nodded, still looking at the clause. "We would like to be on the right side of this kind of trouble," she said. The Dovery representative's name was Amma. She was 22 years old. She had been 4 during the worst of the outbreak. She did not say this. She did not need to. I did not say it either. I just countersigned the charter amendment and moved to the next agenda item, because there was always a next agenda item and there always would be. And this was how you built things, not by making speeches about them, but by doing the next item and then the one after that, until one day you looked up and the thing existed. The Council's first formal communication arrived 14 months in. It was addressed not to any individual party, but to, and I am quoting directly, the parties involved in unauthorized transit activity in unregistered corridor sections adjacent to protected Council space. It outlined several concerns. It referenced the Equilibrium Accords. It used the word irregular 11 times. It did not, notably, use the word illegal, because the Council's own legal team had clearly determined that our activities did not technically violate any registered treaty, which was something I had spent considerable effort ensuring. I read it in full. I set it aside. I had Patrick draft an acknowledgement of receipt. The acknowledgement said, "Thank you for your communication. We note your concerns and will consider them in our ongoing operations." It was 3 sentences long and it took Patrick about 45 seconds to write, which was, I thought, an appropriate ratio. Claire came to find me that evening. She knocked on the door of what had become my permanent office, a room in the Mund Station administrative wing that smelled of recycled air and engine lubricant, and had a window that looked out at the docking bays where, at any given hour, You could see vessels from at least 9 different member species loading and offloading cargo under a common framework that had not existed 2 years ago. "They're scared," she said. "Yes. Good scared or bad scared?" I thought about this. Scared things had 2 modes, the mode where they backed down and the mode where they did something destructive. The Council was not structurally a destructive institution. It was a conservative one. Its entire architecture was oriented toward maintaining a specific equilibrium, which meant that when the equilibrium shifted, its instinct was to wait and see whether it would shift back, rather than to act. We were not going to shift back. "Good scared," I said, "for now." Claire sat down in the chair across from me. She had grown considerably in 2 years. Not in height, obviously. In the other way, the way that happens when someone spends 2 years doing work that is genuinely hard and genuinely matters and has no clean instruction manual. "My colleague from the old mission days," she said. "He called me last week, the one who stayed to work with the appeal process." I waited. "He said the appeal is basically dead. The Council closed 3 of the 5 procedural pathways." She paused. He sounded relieved, actually. "He's not wrong to be," I said. She looked at me. "You knew the appeal would go nowhere." "I thought it was likely." "So you were building this while they were still hoping the appeal would work?" "Claire," I said, "I was building this the day we got on the shuttle home. I was building it in my head for 4 years before that." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a quarry cargo freighter was docking. It was enormous. The quarry did not believe in small vessels, and it moved with the slow, patient grace of something that had been engineered to carry a great deal and was entirely comfortable with its own weight. "What happens when they stop being scared and start being angry?" she asked. "Then we have 31 member partners, a functional trade network, a legal charter, a defense protocol, and enough economic interdependency that being angry at us is the same as being angry at their own supply chains." She thought about this. "That's either brilliant or terrifying." Listen," I said, "those are not mutually exclusive." She almost smiled. She looked out the window at the quarry freighter settling into its dock with the gentle finality of something that had arrived and intended to stay. "Daniel called it the human nervous system of unaligned space," she said. "Daniel was our logistics coordinator, 26, sharp as anything, and prone to saying things that were more accurate than he probably intended." "I know, I'm going to correct him." "To what?" I looked out the window. The freighter was fully docked now. On the loading deck below, I could see crew members from 3 different species coordinating the offload, gesturing, checking manifests on shared data pads, doing the ordinary, unremarkable work of moving things from one place to another under a set of common rules that everyone had agreed to. "A spine," I said. Claire looked at the docking bay. She nodded slowly once. "Yeah," she said, "that's better." The Council's second communication arrived 6 weeks later. It was longer. It used the word irregular 14 times. It also, for the first time, requested a formal dialogue on the matter of corridor management protocols. I read that line 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Owen and Ossel and Vel and Amma, and the other 27 members of what was, by then, no longer being called the Sovereign Trade Initiative by anyone except its founding documents. Everyone else, including us, most days was calling it the Compact. The Council had asked to talk. We wrote back that we would be happy to discuss the matter. We were, after all, reasonable people. We just were no longer operating inside their definition of what reasonable people were permitted to do. 7 years. I know that sounds like a long time. In some ways it was 7 years of corridor disputes, charter revisions, 3 separate arbitration cases between member species, 1 near-catastrophic misunderstanding involving quarry cargo classifications and mund stations, storage protocols that Patrick resolved through what he later described as a combination of careful logic and very good snacks. In other ways, 7 years is nothing. The Council had existed for 300. The trade networks it governed had been running for longer than most of our member species had possessed interstellar travel. You do not displace 300 years of institutional weight in 7. You just make enough of it irrelevant that the rest has to pay attention. I was 41 when the expulsion notice arrived. I was 48 when I sat in the small medical bay on Mund Station and let a doctor named Graham, a soft-spoken man from Edinburgh who had somehow ended up as the station's chief physician and appeared to have made his peace with this entirely, tell me that the shoulder I had been ignoring for 2 years had developed a structural problem that was not going to resolve itself. "You need rest," he said. "I need a working shoulder," I said. Those are the same thing. They were not the same thing. They were, in practice, completely incompatible because the compact's third full assembly was in 11 days, and there were 4 outstanding trade disputes requiring mediation, and Claire had just flagged a concern about a potential boundary issue with a non-member species on the corridor's northern edge that needed careful handling. Graham looked at me the way doctors look at people who have decided that medical advice is optional. "How long has it been since you were home?" he said. I thought about this. Home was the flat in Islamabad. There was a grad student subletting it, a young woman studying xenolinguistics, very responsible, paid on time, had apparently adopted a plant that I had left in the kitchen and that I had assumed was dead. "The plant is still alive," I told Graham. He blinked. "I'm sorry. My flat, the kitchen, I left a plant. My tenant says it's still alive." He looked at me for a long moment. "Aisha," he said, "when did you last sleep more than 5 hours in a row?" I did not answer that. He gave me a list of exercises for the shoulder and told me to avoid carrying anything heavier than 3 kilograms on that side and suggested, with the careful professional neutrality of a man who knows his advice will be ignored, that I consider a break of at least 2 weeks. I thanked him and went back to the assembly preparation. The shoulder was fine, mostly. The assembly itself was the largest the compact had held, 31 member delegations, 12 observer parties, and 3 council-adjacent species attending in an unofficial capacity that everyone present understood perfectly well was not unofficial at all. They had come to see what we were, to measure the room, so to speak, to count the chairs. There were a lot of chairs. I watched the delegations file in from the gallery above the main chamber, a room that Owen had built out of what had previously been a cargo sorting facility. High ceilings, raw structural supports, every surface covered in a patchwork of materials sourced from member species, because nobody had wanted to spend money on unified decor when there was infrastructure to fund. It looked, honestly, like something built by committee over a long period of time, by people who cared more about whether it worked than whether it was beautiful. That was because it was. Amma was there, leading the Dovery delegation now. She had been promoted twice in 3 years, which did not surprise me. The Veth contingent arrived with Ossel at their head, still looking as though he was perpetually about to sneeze. Vel from the quarry came in last, as she always did, moving with the particular energy of someone who treated every entrance as mildly inconvenient and slightly beneath them. And Daniel, 27 years old now, running our arbitration framework with a precision that made my early drafts look like rough sketches, was managing the assembly calendar with a planning document that had more color-coded sections than some governments had ministries. I had recruited Daniel from the UN Trade Division in year 1. He was from Karachi, had a degree in international economic law, and had spent his first month with us apparently under the impression that this was a temporary assignment before he went back to something normal. By month 3, he had redesigned our cargo dispute protocol from scratch, and submitted a 40-page analysis of potential corridor expansion routes that I had subsequently used almost verbatim in 2 council-adjacent negotiations. He had never gone back to anything normal. He found me in the gallery before the assembly opened and stood next to me looking down at the delegations. "The 3 observer species in the back row," he said, "left side. I see them. They filed for observer status through a third-party intermediary. Technically non-council members, but all 3 of them have significant trade dependencies on council-registered lanes. I know. If they shift to compact membership, the council loses about 18% of the traffic through their Eastern Corridor hub. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Below, the delegations were settling in. The ambient noise of 31 species finding their seats had a particular quality, not chaos, not order, something in between, like the sound of a system that had found its own natural arrangement. "Ma'am," he said. He only called me ma'am in serious moments, which was useful as a signal. "The council sent a private communication to the Veth yesterday. I saw it through our monitoring flag." I looked at him. Content. Standard pressure. Lane access implications. Strong suggestion that formal association with the compact creates complications for existing bilateral arrangements. He paused. Ossel's response was 2 sentences. He thanked them for their communication and informed them that the Veth's bilateral arrangements were under satisfactory review through existing compact arbitration mechanisms. I looked back at the assembly floor. Ossel had found his seat. He was drinking coffee. "Good," I said. "They're going to escalate," Daniel said. "Probably. What do we do when they do?" I watched the assembly. All those delegations. All those chairs, the raw structural supports overhead, the patchwork walls, the arbitration court that Daniel had built, the cargo priority protocol that Amma had asked for, the routing maps that Owen had helped refine, the trade agreements that Claire had negotiated and Patrick had supplied, and 100 other people had built piece by piece over 7 years in conference rooms and shuttles and badly ventilated offices on 3 different stations. "We keep building," I said. He nodded. He looked at the assembly floor. "Someone called this the human nervous system of unaligned space," he said. "I said that actually, early on." "I know. I told Claire it was wrong." "What is it then?" I looked at the chamber, at the patchwork walls, at Amma and Ossel and Vel and Owen sitting in the same room under a common charter, solving common problems, planning common futures. "A spine," I said. He thought about it. "Yeah," he said, "that's better." The assembly ran for 3 days. We passed 7 new resolutions. We admitted 2 new member species. We established a permanent arbitration bench, Daniel's proposal, unanimous vote. We approved a defense charter provision that Claire had spent 4 months drafting, which established a mutual response framework for corridor security incidents, and was worded so carefully that it was technically not a military alliance while being functionally indistinguishable from one. The Council's 3rd communication arrived on the last day of the assembly. It was the longest yet. It referenced 8 separate treaty frameworks. It used the word unauthorized 22 times. It also, buried in paragraph 19 of a 23-paragraph document, used a word that none of the previous communications had used. The word was partnership. I read it twice. I set it down. I found Patrick in the assembly hall and handed it to him without comment and watched him read it. He got to paragraph 19. He read it again. He looked up. "Is that what I think it is?" he said. "Read it a 3rd time," I said. He did. "They want to talk," he said. "They want to use a word," I said. "There's a difference, but yes, the direction of travel has changed." He handed the document back. He had the expression he always had when something he had expected to take longer had arrived on schedule. A small, private satisfaction, carefully contained, the look of a man who had distributed aid in 3 conflict zones and learned that the best things come without announcement. I called my mother that evening. From the small private office off the main assembly hall, sitting on the floor because the chair was uncomfortable and the floor was not. The call connected after a moment, and she appeared on the screen looking as she always looked, composed, alert, mildly suspicious of the quality of whatever food I was probably not eating. We talked for 4 minutes. She asked about the shoulder. I said it was fine. She asked when I was coming home. I said soon. She looked at me the way she had looked at me my entire life, which was the look of a woman who had raised someone she understood completely, and that this had never once been a comfort. "Aisha," she said. "Soon," I said. "I mean it." She was quiet for a moment. "The plant is still alive," she said. "I know. That student of yours has been watering it." "I know. You didn't think it would survive." "No," I said, "I didn't." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said very simply, "Things do sometimes." The call ended. I sat on the floor for a while longer. The assembly hall outside was winding down, the sound of delegations packing up, conversations finishing, the particular quiet that follows 3 days of intensive collective work. Through the window I could see the docking bays. 3 different vessels loading simultaneously. Cargo from Corey, crew from Mund, documentation filed under the compact charter. Ordinary, unremarkable. Impossible 7 years ago. I picked up the council's communication from the floor where I had set it. Paragraph 19. The word partnership. Scared things have 2 modes. I had told Claire this. I had been right. The council had chosen the mode where it waited, assessed, recalibrated. Now it was recalibrating towards something new. I thought about what came next. Not the negotiation, that would be Daniel's work, and Claire's and Owen's, and a dozen others who were better suited to the formal architecture of it than I was. What came next for me? The shoulder ached. It had been aching since Mund Station's corridor survey trip 2 years ago, when I had misjudged a transit transfer and hit the frame of an airlock in a way that had made Graham wince sympathetically when I described it. The flat in Islamabad had a plant that was still alive. The council was scared in the productive direction. The compact had 31 members and a spine. I folded the communication and put it in my bag, next to the laminated expulsion notice that had traveled with me for 7 years through 14 stations and 4 shuttle series, and 1 emergency reroute through a corridor section that didn't technically have a name yet. I picked up my bag. I went to find Patrick and tell him we needed to brief the senior partners before morning. There was always a next item. There always would be. That was the point. I had not been inside a council chamber in 11 years. The ceiling was still the same color, that specific, institutional, carefully selected shade of beige that manages to be neither offensive nor interesting, the color of a room that was designed to contain disagreements without anyone being distracted by the walls. I had forgotten it. I was not glad to be reminded. The shuttle that brought me here was compact flagged. That had required a small negotiation of its own, 3 weeks of careful back and forth about docking protocols and visitor transit classifications. And when it finally settled into the council hub's receiving bay, there were 2 council registry officials waiting at the dock to check its credentials, which they did with the careful thoroughness of people who had been told to find a problem and were discovering that there wasn't one. The vessel was Veth-designed, Mund-built, crewed by 6 species, and registered under the compact charter. Every document was in order. Every form had been filed through the correct channels. The officials stamped us through and then stood for a moment watching us walk away with the expression of people who had expected something to be wrong. Nothing was wrong, that was the point. The council's formal invitation had arrived 8 months after paragraph 19. It had taken that long because these things take that long, because institutions of 300 years do not pivot in a week, and because there had clearly been significant internal debate about the precise wording of an invitation to a party you had formally expelled 11 years earlier. The final version was 5 paragraphs long. It was extremely carefully worded. It used the word reconvene. It used the phrase mutual framework exploration. It did not use the word apology because institutions of that age do not use that word, but it used several words that, arranged in that order, did some of the same work. I was Earth's designated respondent. Not by official title. I had not held an official title in the Earth Diplomatic Service for 4 years, having stepped back from day-to-day operations to let Daniel and Claire and their teams run the compact's machinery. I was designated respondent because, when the Secretary General had called to ask who should go, I had said my name before he finished the sentence. Some things you have to do yourself. I had 3 compact colleagues with me. Daniel, who was now running the compact's arbitration court, and had the kind of calm authority that develops in people who spend 5 years resolving disputes between species with incompatible legal traditions. Claire, who had become our chief communications strategist and had a particular talent for saying precisely what was needed in precisely the minimum number of words. And Owen, because Mund Station was a founding anchor, and because Owen had a quality I valued enormously in high-stakes rooms, which was that he was completely unimpressed by buildings. Also, Ossel and Vel had insisted on attending as compact observer representatives, which meant the council chamber had, for the first time in its history, 3 sitting non-member parties in the observer gallery. This had required another small negotiation. We had not moved on it. The chamber was full. 41 delegations. Every council member present, which itself communicated something. This was not a routine session, not a procedural meeting, not the kind of gathering where you sent a mid-tier representative to hold your seat. They had all come. They wanted to see. The observer gallery had 17 seats, all occupied. Vethsar IV was the presiding ambassador. He was 34 years old, by Veth reckoning, and looked like a younger, sharper version of the grandfather whose name he carried. The same elongated frame, the same careful stillness, the face that held its expression with the discipline of someone who had been trained from childhood to negotiate in rooms like this one. He had filed the dissenting vote on our expulsion, as I had eventually discovered. Not his grandfather, him. He had been 12 years old. He had done it under his grandfather's proxy authorization, which the old man had apparently signed without being told specifically what for. I had thought about that for a long time over the years, the deliberate ambiguity of it. The way a dissenting vote, filed quietly, with no announcement, by a 12-year-old under his grandfather's authority, created a kind of record that could mean nothing or could mean everything depending on what happened next. He read the formal invitation terms aloud. The standard opening, the procedural framework for the session, the listed agenda items, re-engagement protocols, mutual framework exploration, pathway discussions for Earth's potential readmission to the Council under revised terms. He finished reading. There was the specific silence of a room full of beings waiting for a response. And then I laughed. Not a short laugh, not a polite, controlled diplomatic laugh. The kind that starts somewhere in your chest and takes a moment to make up its mind about whether it is going to embarrass you or simply define you, and then makes its decision without consulting your professional judgment. 11 seconds. I know because I checked the room recording afterward. In 11 seconds I observed the following. Daniel, to my right, very carefully placed both hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at the ceiling. Claire, to my left, wrote something in her notes. Owen, beside her, did nothing at all because Owen was Owen. In the observer gallery, Ossel's secondary eyelid did a very fast horizontal pass. Vel appeared to be counting something on her fingers. Vethsar IV wrote something down. I stopped. I straightened my jacket. I looked at the chamber of 41 delegations, 17 observers, 300 years of institutional gravity pressing on the air. "Thank you," I said. "We will need to consult our partners." Our partners. I let that phrase sit in the room. It sat the way things sit when they carry weight, not loudly, not dramatically, just present, taking up the space it needed to take up. Vethsar IV wrote something else. I was fairly certain I knew what it said. Something like, she said our partners underlined. He was thorough. His grandfather had been thorough. It apparently ran in the family. One of the other ambassadors, the Durath representative. A species with 4 sets of arms who used 2 of them for communication in their own language, and 2 for everything else, made a gesture with the upper set that our translator flagged as equivalent to clearing a throat. "Deputy Attaché Malik," said the Durath ambassador. His name was Sarath, and he had been in council service longer than I had been in diplomatic service, which I knew because I had read every file available on every person in that room before stepping onto the shuttle. "Ambassador Sarath," I said, "the Council's invitation specifies readmission discussions. Earth's current status as an expelled party means the procedural framework for this session is already established." "I understand," I said. "The Compact's observer presence in this session is, therefore, somewhat irregular." I looked at him. He was not wrong. It was irregular. It was irregular because when the Council had issued the invitation, I had written back and said we would attend on the condition that Compact observer representatives were permitted gallery access, and the Council had agreed to this because the alternative was us not attending at all, and not attending at all was not a position they could afford. I knew they could not afford it because Daniel had spent 3 months running an economic analysis of what happened to the Council's lane traffic and associated revenue if the Compact's observer status expired, and we redirected our member traffic to alternative routes. The number at the bottom of that analysis was not a comfortable number. "Our partners have an interest in the outcome of these discussions," I said. "Their presence is, in our view, appropriate." Sarath processed this. His upper arms made a shorter gesture. "Earth's readmission would require," he said, "dissolution of external arrangements that conflict with Council membership terms. The Compact's charter, as currently structured, contains provisions that would require revision." "Yes," I said, "we understand the Council's position." "Do you dispute it?" "I don't dispute that it is the Council's position." A small pause. Several delegations registered something. I could read about 9 of them clearly, and what I read was the specific expression of parties watching a negotiation and trying to determine which direction the weight is about to move. "We are prepared," Vethsar IV said, speaking for the first time since the opening protocol, "to hear Earth's position on the framework." "Thank you," I said. "Our position is as follows." And then I laid it out, calmly, clearly, without drama, in simple language that the translators could handle cleanly. Earth's position was not readmission under existing terms. Earth's position was observer status at the Council, full access, full communication rights, participation in relevant discussions, while the Compact retained complete legal sovereignty and operational independence. Council lanes to open to Compact members on equal partner terms, not subscriber terms. A joint coordination framework for corridor management, mutually governed. Not readmission, partnership. A different word, a more accurate word, a word that meant something different about the power arrangement underneath it. The chamber processed this. 41 delegations. Some of them I could read clearly. Some of them I had no real access to, species whose emotional communication operated on registers I couldn't interpret with any confidence. But the ones I could read were communicating, to varying degrees, the same thing. They had not expected this. They had expected either capitulation, Earth gratefully returning to a subordinate position within the Council structure, having learned its lesson, or defiance, some kind of posturing rejection of the invitation. They had not expected us to come in and calmly redefine the terms. Sarath's upper arms moved slowly. The Council's existing charter does not accommodate the arrangement you describe. Charters can be revised, I said. 300 years ago, the Council's charter didn't accommodate 12 of the current member species. It was revised. Another pause, longer. Vethsar IV was writing again. He wrote for approximately 15 seconds. Then he looked up at me. "This will require extensive internal consultation," he said. "Of course," I said, "we are patient." The session ran for 6 hours. At the end of it, nothing was agreed and nothing was rejected, which was, in the language of rooms like this one, very close to an agreement. I called Daniel from a bathroom in the council building between sessions. The bathroom was beige. Everything here was beige. "How is it going?" he asked. "They are consulting internally," I said. Which means they called a recess the moment I finished talking, and based on the acoustic bleed through the chamber walls, they have been having a significant disagreement ever since. Silence on the line, then the laugh. I had told him about the laugh during the lunch break. He had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Ma'am, that is either incredible or catastrophically unprofessional." "Those are not mutually exclusive," I had said. Now, on the phone in the beige bathroom, he said, "The observer delegations at our end are watching the Council's public communication channels. They say there has been unusual traffic in the last 2 hours. "Unusual how?" "High volume, encrypted, cross-delegation." "Good," I said. "Good scared or bad scared?" I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. 48 years old. A shoulder that ached when the station recycled its air pressure. A jacket that had been pressed that morning and was already showing the particular fatigue of a long, formal session. Hair that was doing what it wanted, as it had always done. "Good scared," I said. "Definitely good scared." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know, when I took this job, I thought it was a temporary placement." "I know. 8 years ago." "I know." Another pause. "I've been offered a position at the Interstellar Commerce faculty at Edinburgh, full professorship." Owen put in a word, apparently. I looked at the mirror. "That's a good position." "It is," he said. "I turned it down." I didn't say anything. "There's too much left," he said simply. "The Northern Corridor boundary issue, the 3 pending arbitrations, the new member application from the Ethis system." A pause. "The Edinburgh faculty can find someone else. There's only one compact." I looked at the mirror for a moment longer. Then I picked up my bag and went back into the corridor. The second session began with Vethsar IV reading a prepared statement. The statement was careful and long and said, in essence, that the Council was prepared to continue discussions toward a revised framework, that internal consultation would be required on several points, and that a working group would be established to develop specific language. A working group. In Council language, a working group was not a delay. A working group was an acknowledgement that the conversation was real. I thanked him. I agreed to the working group structure. I suggested Daniel as our lead representative, because Daniel was better than me at the particular kind of sustained, detailed, multi-party negotiation that working groups required, and because I had learned, slowly and not without difficulty, that building a thing means knowing when to hand it to someone who can carry it further than you can. The session ended at the early evening. I walked out of the council building alone before the delegations finished filing out, because I wanted a moment outside that wasn't transit or logistics or the next item on the agenda. There was a bench facing a garden. The council building had a garden which I had not known, a formal one, carefully maintained, with plants from about a dozen species arranged in geometric precision. I sat on the bench. The shoulder ached. The garden was quiet. I thought about paragraph 19. I thought about a document with a coffee stain on page 3. I thought about a routing map drawn on a takeaway menu from a Mund Station noodle stall, and a folder with 14 points, and the specific dark of space outside a shuttle window that doesn't have a name in any human language. I thought about a Dovery child sitting in a doorway. The garden was very still. The plants moved slightly in the filtered air circulation of the habitat structure. Somewhere behind me, council delegations were filing out of the building, dispersing to their quarters, beginning the internal consultations that would run for weeks and months, and ultimately arrive at something that looked like a new arrangement. I did not go back inside. I sat on the bench for 40 minutes, just sat. The shoulder ached. The garden was quiet. The stars beyond the habitat dome were doing what they always did, which was exist without caring at all about the things that happened beneath them. After 40 minutes, I picked up my bag and went to find Owen and Daniel and Claire and tell them what came next. There was always a next item. I did not attend the negotiations. That was a choice, and it was the right one. And it was also the hardest professional decision I have made in a career that includes, for reference, deciding to drop antibiotics to a protected species in violation of a council accord while the council was in session, so the bar is not low. The working group ran for 8 months. Daniel led it, with Claire managing communications and a rotating team of compact legal and trade specialists handling the detail work. They flew to the council seat 4 times. Council representatives visited Mund Station twice. The first time, notably, that council officials had ever set foot on compact territory, which was itself a kind of statement, the kind that doesn't need words. I monitored from Islamabad. I had gone home. The grad student, her name was Nina, she was finishing a doctorate in xenolinguistics. She was extremely organized and had apparently repotted the kitchen plan at some point in year 3 and never mentioned it. Had moved out 3 weeks before I arrived, leaving the flat clean and quiet and smelling of someone else's life in a way that was unexpectedly difficult to adjust to. The plant was on the kitchen windowsill. It was a monstera, I discovered, which I had not known when I bought it 7 years ago in the grip of a brief and naive conviction that I could keep things alive without attention. It was considerably larger than I remembered. Nina had clearly been feeding it. I left it where it was. Graham had prescribed a specific physical therapy routine for the shoulder. I did it every morning, at a table by the kitchen window, looking at the plant. It was not a romantic image. A middle-aged diplomat doing shoulder rotations in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, while a monstera plant grew imperceptibly in the corner. But it was a true one, and I had spent enough years dealing in the gap between the image and the truth that I had learned to prefer the true one. The shoulder improved, slowly, then faster. I read everything Daniel sent me. Every session report, every draft framework, every counter-proposal and counter-counter-proposal. The council's position moved, slowly at first, then with increasing specificity, like a glacier that has decided to go somewhere and is committed to the direction. The final framework had 4 components: observer status for Earth, full access, full participation rights, equal partner lane access for all 31 compact members, a joint corridor coordination body, co-governed with no council veto over compact operational decisions, a new humanitarian cargo priority provision that applied to all registered lanes, council and compact both. That last one was Amma's. She had submitted it as a formal compact proposal in month 3 of the negotiations, in the quiet, careful way she did everything, with a 2-page rationale document that was the most efficient piece of writing I had read in years. The council accepted it in month 7. They called it the Emergency Humanitarian Transit Clause. The compact called it the Dovery Provision. Not officially, just among ourselves. The signing ceremony was at Mund Station. Owen had insisted. The council had agreed because agreeing was now the direction they were moving in, and because MUN Station's assembly hall, raw structural supports, patchwork walls, plastic chairs, had a quality that no council building had, which was that it had been built by people who needed it to work rather than to impress. I flew in the night before. Daniel met me at the dock. He had changed in 8 years. Not in the way people say that as a placeholder for something they can't articulate specifically, materially. He was 34 now. He had the kind of face that gets better with work in it. He wore the Compact's informal diplomatic insignia on his collar, which was a small thing, a modest design that Claire's team had developed in year 3, but which had, over time, come to mean something that no one had planned for it to mean. Every Compact representative who wore it was recognized by it. 31 species knew what it was. He handed me a coffee. It was exactly right. He had known me for 8 years. He knew how I took my coffee. "How is the shoulder?" he asked. "Better," I said. "Graham will want to check it." "Graham can check it after the ceremony." He nodded. He walked with me down the corridor toward the assembly hall. Through the walls I could hear the ambient sounds of the station at capacity. More vessels docked than at any previous assembly. Delegations from 31 members and 12 observer parties and the council's official representatives, all in transit or settled or preparing for tomorrow. "The Northern Corridor boundary issue resolved," he said, in the tone he used for things he considered important but was packing carefully. "Arbitration panel ruled last week. Fair outcome. Both parties accepted." "Good. The ETHI's application is through preliminary review. We'll vote at the next assembly." "Good." The Edinburgh faculty called again. I looked at him. "I told them I was busy," he said, "indefinitely." We walked in silence for a moment. The station sounds moved around us, the low hum of systems, the distant echo of loading bays, the specific quality of a place that is always in motion, always moving things from one location to another, always in the business of connection. "Daniel," I said. "Ma'am, you built this." He looked at me. He had the expression of someone about to disagree, which I preempted. "You and Claire and Owen and Amma and Patrick and 40 other people who were in this for 8 years. You built it." He was quiet for a moment. "You made the folder," he said. "The folder was a beginning. Everything has to begin somewhere." We reached the assembly hall. The doors were open. Inside, the hall was set for tomorrow, the same raw ceiling, the same patchwork walls, chairs arranged in the formation Daniel's team had designed for a mixed-species assembly of this size. At the front, a long table for the signing. It looked like what it was, a room that had been built for a purpose and had served that purpose and was about to serve a larger one. I stood at the door for a moment. "Go sleep," Daniel said, "for more than 5 hours." "I will. I'll see you at 7. He went back into the logistics of the evening. I walked to the small office that had been mine for years, the one with the window looking out at the docking bays. I sat down. I put my bag on the desk. I did not take out the laminated document. It was in there, it was always in there. It had traveled with me to 14 stations and 4 council-adjacent territories and 1 negotiation session where I had laughed for 11 seconds in front of 17 delegations, but I left it in the bag. The ceremony the next morning ran for 2 hours. The council's senior ambassador read the framework terms aloud. Each compact member representative signed. The council representative signed. Ossel signed with his small, neat, compressed wave mark. Vel signed last among the compact members, in the unhurried way she did everything, as though she was granting the document permission to matter. I was not signing. This was not my signature moment. I was in the gallery. There was a reception afterward in the assembly hall. The chairs had been moved back. A long table of food and drinks arranged along one wall, items from compact member species. A deliberate mix. The kind of buffet that requires 5 translations and 3 separate preparation areas, and is always, somehow, better than it has any right to be. A young woman found me at the edge of the room. She was not someone I recognized immediately. She was from the Corey collective, the copper-tinged skin, the particular way they held their shoulders, and she was perhaps 20 years old, wearing a compact trade coordinator badge. She stood in front of me and said, in Urdu that was careful and deliberate and slightly formal in the way that second languages always are, "You are Aisha Malik." I looked at her. "I am." She said something that I had to ask her to repeat, not because I hadn't heard it, but because I wanted to be sure I had understood. She repeated it in the same careful Urdu, and what she said was, "I was born at Mund Station. My parents came here through the corridor in year 2. My mother was in medical care here when I was born." She paused. She said the doctors here were good, from many places. I stood with that for a moment, the station sounds around us. The reception, 31 species in a patchwork room. "What is your name?" I said. "Priya," she said. "Where did you get the Urdu?" I said. "Station school," she said. "We learned 4 languages. I chose this one." She paused. It felt important. I looked at her. 20 years old. Born at Mund Station in year 2 of the corridor, when the whole structure was held together by 14 agreements and Daniel's color-coded planning document and Patrick's very good snacks. "It is important," I said. She smiled. The Corey expression was different from a human smile. The lines of it ran differently, but the quality of it was the same. Then she said in English now, "Thank you for the beginning." She moved back into the reception. I watched her go. I had not cried at the expulsion notice. I had not cried in the shuttle home. I had not cried when the compact reached 31 members, or when the council sent its paragraph 19, or when Vethsar IV read the invitation in that beige chamber, and I laughed for 11 seconds. I cried now. Quietly, at the edge of a reception in a patchwork room on a station in unregistered space, while 31 species ate food from each other's worlds, and Daniel talked to a council representative in a corner, and Claire managed 4 conversations simultaneously with the ease of someone who had been doing this for 8 years. I did not explain it to anyone. I did not need to. I went back to Islamabad 3 days later. The flat was quiet. The Monstera was on the windowsill. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and did not open my bag and did not check messages for 2 hours, which was the longest I had gone without checking messages in 8 years. Then I opened my bag. I took out the laminated document. I set it on the table. Coffee stain on page 3. My name on the acknowledgement line. 11 years of consequence folded inside 17 pages. I looked at it for a long time. People keep trophies for things they win against someone. That is the common understanding of the word. A trophy means a defeat, a conquest, something taken. This was not a trophy. The council had removed us from the table. They had done it correctly by their rules, with proper procedure and 90 days' notice and a laminated document. They had expected us to appeal or to diminish, or to return on their terms when the exile became untenable. We had done something else. We had not built another table. We had not demanded a seat at theirs. We had built the room that their table was going to have to exist inside, and then we had invited everyone in, and then we had waited patiently, incrementally, item by item, until the room was real enough that the people inside it could not be argued with, only partnered with. Listen. That is what an empire is, not the thing that conquers, the thing that other things have to think about. And a thing built that way, built from a folder and a coffee-stained document, and a routing map on a takeaway menu, built by Patrick and Claire and Daniel and Owen and Amma, and 100 others, built by Priya's parents arriving through the corridor in year 2, built by Asal's small neat signature, and Vel's unhurried patience, and a 12-year-old Veth boy filing a dissenting vote under his grandfather's authority without explaining why. A thing built that way does not belong to the person who made the folder. It belongs to everyone who needed it to exist. I put the document back in the bag. I finished my coffee. I looked at the monstera on the windowsill. It had not done anything dramatic. It had simply grown in the direction of available light, steadily, season after season, while everyone around it lived their lives and paid it no particular attention. And here it still was. I went to water it.